In the absent members.
On that motion, all in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails and the Sergeant at Arms will bring in the absent members. We will revert to the 8th order of business, introduction and first reading of Senate bills listed in the addendum members. On the introduction calendar are Senate files 2924 and 2925. These two Senate files are given their first reading and referred as indicated. Remaining under motions and resolutions, Senate resolution numbers 118 through 120 will be referred to the Committee on Rules and Administration. Next, we have a couple conference committee reports at the desk. We will take these up. The first one is the conference committee report on Senate File 316. Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations and conference committee report on Senate File 316 be now adopted and the bill be repassed as amended by the conference committee.
To that motion, Senator Howe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, this is the user acceptance fee. So when the state rolls out a new piece of software or technology that local governments get a chance to test it and do a beta testing before it's accepted and rolled out. What we did was once we found that the deputy registers were included in the agent's language and also those that sell licenses were included, we accepted the House language as it was much cleaner.
Discussion on the conference committee report for Senate File 316. Seeing none, Senator Howe renews his motion to adopt the conference committee report on Senate File 316. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails. The Secretary will give Senate File 316 its third reading.
Senate File number 316, a bill for an act relating to state government.
Third reading. Members, we are on final passage of the conference committee report on Senate File 316. Seeing no further discussion, the Secretary will take the roll. All members having voted who have the desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 63 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Members, next we'll take up the Conference Committee report on Senate File 2415. Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations in Conference Committee report on Senate File 2415 be now adopted and that bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee.
Senator Anderson to that motion.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, Senate File 2415 is the Higher Education Omnibus Bill. We've got many people to thank here for this bill and this work in the Conference Committee. I want to thank special thank to the Conference Committee members, Senator Clausen, Senator Draheim, Senator Jensen, and Senator Ralph. Also staff, Committee Administrator Tricia Elite, researcher Brittany Johnson, Jason Fossum, and Rachel Bakke. And a special thank you to Chair Bernardi, the House Chair of the Higher Education Committee, and Commissioner of Higher Education Dennis Olson, and both of their staff. Members, there was a lot of give and take. The bill has changed quite a bit since it left here a couple weeks ago, but this is a really good bill for higher education in the state of Minnesota. It's good for our students, our systems, our workforce and businesses, and just overall for today and tomorrow with regards to higher education. This is a good bill. It's a $150 million bill. A couple of the highlights, members, $18.162 million for the state grant. We've got for Min-State, we've got a $64.5 million biennium for operations for the University of Minnesota. It's at $43.5 million in the biennium. Again, we're funding the systems. We're funding state grant. We've got some great programs with regards to workforce development that we've talked about in the past. This is, members, going to be work that continues in the next few years when we are addressing the workforce shortages all across the state and in different regions, in different areas, from healthcare to high tech, to IT, to agriculture, to skilled manufacturing, to transportation and childcare. All areas that we desperately need workers and an opportunity for these workforce scholarships to really make a difference. We've got a lot of other different provisions in here that's going to do some really good things for students and our families, in our institutions members. But I would like to turn it over to Senator Draheim, who did significant work on a few policy provisions, if I could, Mr. President.
Discussion on the adoption of the Conference Committee report. Senator Draheim.
Thank you, President Miller, and thank you, Chair Anderson, for all your work and staff, and of course, Senator Clausen and the rest of the Committee for Higher Ed. A couple provisions I'd like to talk about. There was a lot of give and take, a lot of compromise. The first part is the Z degree, which focuses on students by reducing textbook costs. This bill would require 3 Min-State colleges to offer Z degrees. And for those who don't remember, the Z degree is 0 textbook costs for an AA degree. So it's a step in the right direction. Although we weren't able to lower online tuition costs, this bill freezes online tuitions and requires our system to justify the additional costs. So we had the online parity where we couldn't charge, we were proposing that we didn't charge more for online courses than we do classroom. We compromised, and this is where we ended up. And I think both provisions are crucial for putting students first and making college more affordable. Thank you, members.
Further discussion on the adoption of the Conference Committee report for Senate File 2415. Senator Cohn.
Mr. President, if Senator Anderson would yield for a question.
Senator Anderson will yield. Senator Cohn.
Mr. President, Senator Anderson, I appreciate the work you've done on this bill, and I serve on your committee, of course. But there's a concern that we've started to institutionalize. I want to ask you about it. Over the years, and I can't remember to what extent dollar for dollar, but approximately there has been a rough equal amount appropriated for the University of Minnesota system and the Min-State system. Now, I don't in any way diminish the importance of the Min-State system to the state of Minnesota. It is exceedingly important. But for years, this legislature and the governors would try to approximate the same amount of money appropriated as new dollars for both systems. This began to change in 2015. And I recognize, Senator Anderson, you were a member of the Senate then, but let me offer you just a little bit of what happened. And at that time, I chaired the Finance Committee, and in negotiations with the governor and the House was a Republican majority House, we arrived at a figure for the higher education bill, the target figure, as you have received in the last couple of days, or yesterday, I guess. And what I found, Senator Bonoff was your predecessor, not only your predecessor as a senator, but your predecessor as chair of the committee, was that in negotiations with the Republicans in the House, there was a refusal to approximate the same amount of money. And I was simply very, very surprised. And I suggested to Senator Bonoff that she continue to negotiate. She tried to do so and came back to me several times and said they would not budge. That's the first time that we had that difference between the systems. 2 years ago, with Senator Fischbach as the chair, that happened again, and I believe with even a greater difference between the two systems. Now we're starting to institutionalize this. And I'm curious, Senator Anderson, as to why we are diminishing the University of Minnesota system at this point and not doing, again, what historically we had done in terms of trying to treat the systems approximately equally.
Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator Cohen, good question. With regards to Min-State and the University of Minnesota, in historical terms, currently, when the budget targets or the requests came in, Min-State came in at $146 million for operations. University of Minnesota came in at $87 million. University of Minnesota, of course, when it comes to revenues, far surpasses Min-State with regards to the sources they have, research and endowment and the like. Min-State serves more students as well. When it came down to our target of $150 million, Senator Cohen, the preference of when in negotiations was for members of our group were to split those numbers in half and try and do the best they can to fund those requests with the target we had.
So,
Senator Cohen.
Mr. President, Senator Anderson, so I appreciate the explanation, but what we have seen in this body over the last several years, and I think it's a little bit striking, we went through this significant debate, discussion, and a fairly contentious environment relative to the selection of members of the Board of Regents for the University of Minnesota this session. So it suggested to me that irrespective of how members of the legislature voted relative to the regents, that people took the University of Minnesota system quite seriously. And I appreciate your explanation, but we continue to see what I would suggest is a diminishment in this body of the attention paid to the University of Minnesota. The assumption that they have other revenue sources. And again, that's not to suggest that we should not put lots of money into the Min-State system. I'm just disappointed to see that we continue to perpetuate what has become a recent division. And the University of Minnesota system 6 years ago, 8 years ago, irrespective of governors. Obviously, Senator Anderson, you worked as the Deputy Chief of Staff for Governor Pawlenty. Throughout his term in office, you had that same approximation between the two systems when Governor Pawlenty was governor, when Governor Carlson was governor, when Governor Ventura. And this has happened only recently. And I'll be honest, with disappointment, with the acquiescence of Governor Dayton. So I'm disappointed to see that we're starting to perpetuate this on a basis that I think will be difficult to turnaround in the future. And I just thought I would express that and understand the work you've put into this, but it is a disappointment for the University of Minnesota.
Further discussion on the adoption of the committee report. Senator Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And as a member of the conference committee, I'd like to thank my conference committee colleagues, our staff, and chairs, Representative Bernardi and Senator Anderson. There's quite a few good things in this bill. I look at always the big three: the Minnesota Student Grant Program, Minnesota State appropriation, and the University of Minnesota appropriation. I think we did a good job as best we could with the funding that we had. Workforce scholarship funding is a real plus. We had Teachers of Color grants in there, College Possible, summer academic enrichment programs, Reconnect funding for the stop-out students. That's an important so we can reach our state attainment goal of 70% of our workforce between the ages of 25 and 44 to have a higher education degree or certificate by 2025. Also like to thank members of the Higher Education Committee who worked very hard over several months to craft a bill that we could start with as a conference committee, and overall I think it's a good bill. Thank you.
Further discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report. Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I appreciate people talking about the bill on the floor, but I'm looking for the spreadsheet, and I don't see spreadsheets on anyone else's desk. And will Senator Anderson yield, please?
Senator Anderson will yield. Senator Pappas.
Senator Anderson, I believe it's the custom before we vote on a bill on the floor, a conference committee report, for us to see the spreadsheet so we know. I mean, Senator Cohen was talking about more money from in-state, not as much for the university. Senator Clausen mentioned a bunch of programs. You mentioned some, but evidently some people are privileged enough to have spreadsheets and others are not.
Senator Anderson.
Mr. President and Senator Pappas, we will get copies out as soon as possible here.
Any further discussion? Senator Senjum.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would the author yield?
Senator Anderson will yield. Senator Senjum.
Take your time, Senator Anderson. Senator Anderson, I'm just wondering, I had and thank you for it, a small provision in the bill having to do with the deaf and hard of hearing teacher training initiative that would provide, again, trained teachers for those that have those needs in Minnesota. Did that survive?
Senator Anderson.
Mr. President and Senator Senjum, unfortunately, in all the give and take, that did not survive. Like many of programs that we were hopeful to make into the final bill, this was one that unfortunately didn't make it into the final bill.
Members, any further discussion? Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. President. I guess I wanted to just reiterate what Senator Cohen said about the University of Minnesota. It was really my policy when I was chair of the Higher Ed Committee. I used the expression, I love all my children. And I think that treating the University of Minnesota equally to Min-State is really important in both bonding situations, and I know Senator Senjum is very aware of my feelings on that, and also in the budget bill. Yes, it's true that there are more students that Minnesota State educates, but the university also has a research mission, and they are the University of Minnesota is our flagship university. And so it started a few years ago. Senator Cohen, I think, mentioned he had a conversation with Senator Bonoff about it, and then it got worse during the next chair. I don't think that Senator Fischbach, she had different opinions about the university than I did, and now we see again there's still that differential. So I would just like the committee members and the chairs and the ranking Democrat to please be more conscious of the importance of the University of Minnesota in future budgets. Thank you.
Further discussion on the adoption of the committee report. Senator Draheim.
Thank you, President Miller. I'd like to respond a little bit to a few of the comments on how we treat each system. I think we, as a committee, I think we work hard to treat both systems equally. They are totally different systems. They have different needs. The Min-State system does a lot of workforce training here in the state. We have been more or less retooling the Min-State two-year institutions for workforce, and they have more students. You know, they have 54 locations versus more or less 6 locations for the U. They have different needs, and we try to balance that out. So I will defend that, and I think all the committee members will, that we try very hard to treat everybody the same. And then to some of the comments about how we're treating higher ed, you know, I've only been here 3 years, but if my memory serves me, the Republicans have had control of the Senate, I think 3 or 5 years out of the last 45 years. So I think the 3 years I've been here, this is my second budget year, we have focused above base on higher education. I think we put a couple $100 million in 2 years ago, and now we're putting another $150 million in. So I think we're trying to do the right thing for the students of Minnesota, trying to control costs, and enrollment's down. And that's one piece of the puzzle I don't think it's discussed enough, that enrollment is down. So funding has to reflect that. Thank you.
Members, any further discussion on the conference committee report? Senator Lance.
Mr. President, members, I think one question we might ask is, why is enrollment down? Maybe it has something to do with the lack of investment in our higher education systems, or a shortage of investment compared to needs. Actually, would Senator Anderson yield for a question?
Senator Anderson will yield. Senator Lance.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Anderson, with the enactment of this budget, can you tell us what proportion of the cost of providing education at the University of Minnesota will be borne by the general fund disappropriation to the university, as opposed to other resources that the university brings in, tuition and research grants and so on?
Senator Anderson.
Mr. President, Senator Lance, it's my understanding that the general fund money that goes to the university provides about 17% of their funding.
Senator Lance.
Mr. President, there used to be an aspirational goal in statute. Oh, let me ask a follow-up question. What percentage is for Minnesota State system as well?
Senator Anderson.
Mr. President and Senator Lance, it's approximately 50% of Minnesota State's funding.
Senator Lance.
So, Mr. President, I guess this illustrates two things. One is, we used to have in statute for Min-State, and certainly as an implied aspiration, if not in statute for the University of Minnesota, that the state would pay 2/3 the cost of providing the education to our students. Boy, have we fallen short. I knew it had fallen at least to 1/3 for the University of Minnesota, but to hear it's at 17%, we really ought to be ashamed of ourselves that we're not providing more than 17% of the cost of educating at our internationally recognized research land-grant institution, the University of Minnesota. And then if you identify the disparities between Min-State and the University of Minnesota, if Min-State's getting 50% from the state taxpayers' general fund and the University of Minnesota is only getting 17%, I mean, that illustrates it even more starkly how little commitment this legislature is giving to funding the University of Minnesota, which is still recognized as the economic engine of the state of Minnesota, with the foreign students that it brings in and the out-of-state students from around the country that come in because of the incredibly high academic quality of their teaching, because of the high level and cutting edge research that they do across all the disciplines, because of the grant funding that they bring in from NIH and other places demonstrates the medical advances and the medical technology advances, and a variety of other international level quality of education that we have here in Minnesota. And for the state to only be providing 17% of the budget, well, you know where else that comes from? It lands on tuition. So I know we all have the goal of 0% tuition increases, but you know what? If the state's not raising their own revenues and putting it into the University of Minnesota, no one should be surprised that the U is going to make up those gaps by raising the tuition on their students, because they still want to retain the world-class faculty, provide that world-class education, do the world-class level research, which helps drive the economy around Minnesota, and not just because there are people consuming textbooks and sandwiches around the Twin Cities campus, but because they're providing research which builds out to all of the businesses and the entrepreneurial startups that we have in Minnesota in all sorts of disciplines. So I guess I want to share some of my colleagues' expressions of a great deal of concern with where this is going. And we can do better. We must do better. It's a matter of whether or not we have the political will to do better. And at some point, we are going to suffer economically down the road because we just haven't taken care of the jewel of our institution.
Further discussion on the adoption of the committee report. Senator Draheim.
Thank you, President Miller. If I could, members, when we look at enrollment, there is a pattern, and part of the pattern has to do with the economy. When you have 50-year low unemployment and a strong economy like we're in right now, enrollment tends to drop in colleges. And when we have a high unemployment and a slow growth economy, enrollment increases. So it's a well understood in the higher education community that's the case. It's very common throughout the country. And then one other point in regards to Min-State. I had the pleasure of touring various campuses across the state this last year. I think I visited 16 different campuses, got a lot of time with the faculty. And when you talk to the faculty at Min-State, about 50% of the students have to take remedial courses. 50% have to take remedial courses. And I think that has to do with the cost to operate the college. So I think that's a direct reflection on Min-State trying to get kids through, trying to help them out, but it does cost more. So I just want to make those 2 points. Thank you, President.
Further discussion on the adoption of the committee report. Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. President. I had a question and I have a comment. Senator Anderson will yield.
Senator Anderson will yield. Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Anderson, there was quite a bit of discussion when this bill was first passed about the situation with online courses and a lot of information that they are actually more expensive to develop and teach than regular courses. Could you tell me what the conference committee came up with?
Senator Anderson.
Mr. President and Senator Pappas, Senator Draheim touched on this a little bit. I think it's yet to be determined, depending on the institution and the different situations on the actual cost, on the cost and the justification of the cost of online classes compared to in-person classes. And so in the discussions and negotiations with the conference committee, what we determined is we are asking for a report, a full report on justifications of costs when it comes to online courses, and also a freeze at current levels for online tuition classes. We removed the requirement that the tuition parity that was previously discussed.
Senator Pappas.
Thank you, Mr. President. I apologize. I missed that in Senator Draham's comments. But Senator Draham, you did say something about remedial courses, and I just want to comment that this has really bothered me for a long time, that students are using their precious financial aid to pay for remedial courses, and they don't get credit for them. And so then they're going to run out of financial aid before they complete their years in college. I don't even think it's actually, I think there's been research done, and I hope that the Higher Ed Committee will take a look at this, that it's actually better for students to have remedial help during the regular course than to take a separate course. That way, they're going to get credit for the class, they're going to use their financial aid to actually get credit, but they get the help as they go along. And so this has been a problem from 10 years ago, and so I hope that the committee will take a look at that in the future. Thank you.
All right, members, we're on the adoption of the conference committee report for Senate File 2415. Looks like we have some further discussion. Senator Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Latz yield, please?
Senator Latz will yield. Senator Jensen.
Senator Latz, I may have misheard you before, but did you say that we should be ashamed because we were providing 17% of the funding for the University of Minnesota?
Senator Latz.
Mr. President, Senator Jensen, yes, in comparison to what we ought to be providing. We used to be providing 2/3 of the cost of the education at the University of Minnesota. And if the number has dropped all the way down to 17%, yes, we are inadequately funding the University of Minnesota, and that reflects priorities of this legislature.
Senator Jensen.
Mr. President, would Senator Latz yield?
Senator Latz will yield. Senator Jensen.
Senator Latz, I just need to understand the math a little better. Could you share with me what your thought is in regards to what the University of Minnesota budget is and what level of funding we're providing in this budget? Because I'm just not getting to the same numbers you are. Thank you.
Senator Latz.
Mr. President, Senator Jensen, I'm taking the number from Senator Anderson, the chair of the Higher Ed Committee, who responded to my question, what proportion of the educational costs at the University of Minnesota is being paid for by our general fund here at the state legislature that we're appropriating in our budget cycle. So if the quarrel is with the number 17%, I think you need some clarification from Senator Anderson. I can't provide you with any more.
Thank you,
Senator Jensen.
Mr. President. When I looked at the historical revenue from the University of Minnesota in terms of what they're reporting, I think in 2013, I think we did not have divided government at that time, and I believe that we provided, according to the University of Minnesota, $1.1 billion. Today, their budget is approximately $4 billion, and we're providing 1.3, which is somewhere around 35%. And I think we're providing, if you take the 2% inflation rate from 2013, when there was not divided government, and you multiply that, we should be somewhere around 1.2 billion, but instead we're providing 1.3 billion. And if you look at a cross-section of Big Ten colleges, which I've done, and look at where the University of Minnesota is, I grant Senator Latz the fact that we're not at the top, but we're not at the bottom either. So perhaps anybody can choose whatever words they want, but in this time where we've increased our general fund spending from $30 billion in 2010 to somewhere around $48 billion now, we're far outstripping the inflation rate. And if Senator Latz wants to feel ashamed, he can.
Members, any further discussion on the adoption of the committee report? Senator Latz.
Mr. President, I think that's grossly unfair. If the numbers that Senator Jensen is stating are the accurate reflection, then it's not 17%, as Senator Anderson stated. Senator Clausen just informed me that the numbers are more close to 49% for the Minnesota state system and 41% for the University of Minnesota, which is not nearly as bad as 17% for the University of Minnesota. And Senator Jensen did the math in his head and came up with about 35% for the University of Minnesota. So I don't know what the actual number is. I do know that we're falling short. I do know that our students are bearing that burden by paying higher tuition costs and borrowing more to go get their higher education. I do know that without that higher education, our economy is not sustainable in the long term. And I do know that if we are failing in our K-12 system, then our students who do want to go on to higher education are going to have to pay more and spend more time getting those remedial courses at the college level. So really, we ought to make sure that we are adequately funding our K-12 system and making sure that our students are graduating with the basic level of knowledge and capabilities when they graduate from high school, so they don't need to take the remedial courses when they get to the Minnesota State University system. The other thing I will point out is that, and this is just a fact of geography, there are a lot more bricks and mortar institutions for Minnesota State throughout the state of Minnesota, and therefore within many more legislators' districts than there are bricks and mortar institutions of the University of Minnesota. When I was on the Higher Education Committee in the House, and again for a period of time here in the Senate, I was maybe the only or one of two legislators that didn't actually have a MnSCU, or now Minnesota State institution, physically located in my district, which meant that I had more freedom, perhaps, to explicitly support the University of Minnesota without offending a Minnesota State constituency within my own district. I think Minnesota State deserves to have the funding that they are getting. The University of Minnesota deserves to have more, and we need some more people who are willing to stand up and be champions of that on our higher education committees, and less so for the disparities that we are finding now.
Further discussion on the adoption of the committee report, Senator Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Latz, we have many discussions, and we went offline this morning and talked about building relationships and things like that. I don't know of any bigger champion for higher education than Senator Clausen. He tirelessly pushes us and tells us that we need to, no, it's not you, Senator Isaacson, it's Senator Clausen. And I just think that it's rhetoric when you say that we should be ashamed, because the pie is only so big, Senator Latz, and we know that. Where are we going to take the money? We're all feeling the pinch. The $150 million target we ended up with here was an increase from the governor's request. I would love to see us do more for the University of Minnesota. I just think that when we say we ought to be ashamed, we're just spewing rhetoric, and I don't think that's a conversation or a relationship builder.
Members, further discussion on the adoption of the committee report, Senator Latz.
Well, Mr. President, Senator Jensen keeps referring to the word ashamed, even though he's given different numbers that led to that conclusion. So I'm not quite sure why he continues to repeat that number. But let me make a much more important point. The majority caucus in this body today created the size of the pie. It was your decision how much money is in the pie, and your decision, therefore, how much could be distributed among the targets and the slices of the pie. So you can't complain now that there's not enough money in the pie to do what needs to be done.
Any further discussion on the adoption of the committee report? Seeing none, Senator Anderson renews his motion to adopt the conference committee report on Senate File 2415. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails. The Secretary will give Senate File 2415 its third reading.
Senate File Number 2415, a bill for an act relating to higher education.
Third reading. Final discussion on the bill. Senator Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And Senator Latz, just for clarification, if I misunderstood your question, I thought your question was resources with regards to how the university receives, and that is 17% of their resources comes from general fund. With regards to student responsibility, as Senator Clausen mentioned to you, that is closer to 50%. Members, going forward, and I really appreciate hearing from a couple of my colleagues tonight I hadn't heard from this session, and I look forward to hearing from all of our members outside of our committee, in our committee, attending our committees, and having further discussion. But we do, as lawmakers, have a real responsibility not just to fund and just recognize and fund and fund and fund, but we also have a real responsibility when it comes to holding institutions accountable for those state dollars that we contribute, that we give to our institutions. We need to make our institutions more affordable and more accessible to our Minnesotan students. We need to make them more relevant, and that's going to take a lot of work on our part as well. When we fund 17% of the resources of the University of Minnesota, and we elect those board of regents, when we fund Minnesota State at 50% and confirm those board of trustees, we are responsible for looking for those ways as well as the institutions in trying to curb the costs of higher education. We have historic debt problems. We can't just simply feed the beast. Let's continue to work together to find ways to not only invest in our systems, the University of Minnesota and MnState and our private colleges. We have some of the best institutions in the entire country, if not the world, and I am proud to fight every day as the chair of the Higher Education Committee for all of our institutions. And anything less is unacceptable. So thank you, members. I hope you will join me with a green vote.
Members, we're on final passage of the conference committee report for Senate File 2415. Seeing no further discussion, the secretary will take the roll.
programs that we've tried to introduce that were successful, and hopefully
All members having voted who have the desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 62 ayes and 3 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Remaining under motions and resolutions, we have a resolution at the desk that the Secretary will read.
Senators Clausen and Carlson introduced Senate Resolution number 121, a Senate resolution congratulating Kennedy Clifford Mindeman on graduating first in his class in electrical engineering from the University of Minnesota Duluth.
Senate Resolution number 121 will be referred to the Committee on Rules and Administration. Remaining under motions and resolutions, we will revert to the third order of business, messages from the House. We have a conference committee report on House File 400.
I will read the message.
The Secretary will read the message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce that the House has adopted the recommendation and report of the Conference Committee on House File number 400 and repassed said bill in accordance with the report of the committee. So adopted. House File number 400 is a bill for an act relating to health establishing the Opioid Addiction Advisory Council. House File number 400 is herewith transmitted to the Senate. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
Senator Rosen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the foregoing recommendations and Conference Committee report on House File 400 be now adopted and that the bill be repassed as amended by the Conference Committee.
To that motion, Senator Rosen. Senator Rosen, do you want to explain the bill, please? Or the Conference Committee report?
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, we have a historic moment here, and I'm actually very humbled by this moment. And I'm humbled by this bill. We've been working on this issue, this bill, for a very long time, and it's before us tonight, and it is going to be signed by this governor, hopefully very, very soon. I first want to thank so many people, but first and foremost, my CA, Brian Perro. I could not have done this job without him. And my LA, Ruth Gredvick, so many thanks to you. And of course, the A-team, and many of you know the A-team in this chamber. Tim Bowl, Andrea Todd Harlan, thank you so much for all you do. And of course, Katie Kavanaugh and Dennis Albrecht, who had such a part of this bill. This is very similar to what we passed originally, the Conference Committee, but with a few major changes. And one was the sunset on the fees that are collected on the manufacturers and the distributors. The House did accept the Senate's language for the fee structure, which I think is so important to make sure that we have an ongoing appropriation of a little over $20 million every year until the fee is, there's a sunset and a settlement of $250 or $250 million or 5 years. And that at that time, the fee structure goes down to $5,000 for all manufacturers and distributors. But at this point, the fee structure would be $5,000 annually for all drug wholesalers and manufacturers, and then any opioid manufacturer would have an additional $50,000, which would be $55,000. And then any opioid manufacturer who manufactures 2 million or more entered into Minnesota per year would have an additional $250,000 on top of that, which that fee would be $305,000. Sounds complicated. It's really not. The House had our fee structure from last year, and we worked on this with the folks outside these doors, with all the interest groups, and it seems like a very, very fair adjustment for doing business and for their part in this opioid epidemic that we have that has absolutely ruined so many lives and affected so many families. So with that, the bill that we passed a couple months ago had a sunset of $20 million. We now have a sunset of $250 million or 5 years. And we have to get up to $250 million or it's 5 years. And then it clicks down to $5,000 for everyone and generates a little over $12.6 million a year, which 50% of the money will go to a council that's been put together, and 50% of the money will go to out-of-home placement cost for the children that have been affected and for the counties that are dealing with this issue. And as we have talked about many times, either in Health and Human Services or on the floor here, you always know there is a problem with drug addiction in the counties when you see the increase in out-of-home placement costs, and that's exactly what we are seeing right now. And it's the children and the family, and that's the reason why I decided I needed to do something about this with the help of Senator Eaton. She brought this bill to me, and her hard work. And Senator Eaton, you've been a champion on this, and I thank you so much for all your guidance and your help and your knowledge and your passion towards this bill. The Advisory Council is very important to this bill. They're going to have a tremendous amount of money, especially if we receive a settlement from the federal lawsuits that we have in place against the pharmaceutical companies. Oklahoma just received $250 million from Purdue Pharma. And hopefully, we are in, I believe, 3 lawsuits. The Attorney General has 3 various lawsuits against the pharmaceutical companies. And it is so imperative that we have this language and that we have this account in place where the money will be deposited, because that is one of the requirements for a settlement of this kind. When we do receive a settlement, or we do have this $250 million in place, there is a guarantee of $20 million per year ongoing that'll be handled by the council to the counties and to the various treatment programs, to the various prevention programs that the council will deem worthy of this money. And members, if you'd like to know who is on the council, we spent a lot of time on this issue. There's 19 members, which is a lot, but there's 3 of them that are non-voting. But of course, there are legislators on there. My apologies here. There is a member of the Board of Pharmacy, a member who is a physician appointed by the Minnesota Medical Association, 1 member who is representing the Opioid Treatment Program, Sober Living Program, Substance Use Disorder Program, a member from the Minnesota Society of Addiction Medicine, who is an addiction psychiatrist, 1 member representing professionals providing alternative pain management therapies, including but not limited to acupuncture, chiropractor, and massage therapy, 1 member representing nonprofit organizations conducting initiatives to address the opioid epidemic, and it does specifically say the Steve Remler Hope Network, which they have done amazing work. A member from the Minnesota Ambulance Association, and from the court system, who is either a judge or a law enforcement officer. A member who is in opioid addiction recovery. 2 members represented Indian tribes, 1 from the Ojibwe and 1 from the Dakota tribes. 1 member who is a Minnesota resident and suffering from chronic pain, intractable pain, and rare disease or condition. And this piece I want to point out specifically, members, because we heard a lot of testimony in the Health and Human Services and Senator Abler and Senator Benson's committee about this issue. And trust me when I say we are not delegating how chronic pain is handled. It is just the acute pain that the regulations are handled in this bill. 1 mental health advocate representing persons with mental illness, 1 member representing the Minnesota Hospital Association and a local health department, and then, of course, the commissioners, Human Services, Health, and Corrections. And there is specific language in here to ensure that at least 1/2 of the council members appointed by the commissioner reside outside of the 7-county metro, and that to the extent practical, at least 1 member must represent a community of color disproportionately affected by the opioid epidemic, because we all know the Native Americans and the African Americans have been tremendously hit by this problem. And I lost my place in line here. Thank you. That's why I have Brian Perro by my side. So I went through the council, which I think is extremely important to make sure that this ongoing money that we're going to have in this account is appropriately delegated to the issues at hand. And this is always going to be, the legislature is going to have the ability to look at what these monies are being appropriated for. We can't necessarily say what they can be used for, but we have the ability to say you can't use it for that. Any of the dollars that are being delegated right now will have a shut-off after 5 years, and the legislature will again take another look at it. As I mentioned, the settlement, I think that, and the sunset, that was extremely important. The House did not have any sunset provision, and we fought very hard. And I just want to say a huge thank you to Senator Rich Draheim and Senator Chris Eaton, the conference committee members, who were amazing to work with on this, and they supported me all the way in the behind the scenes and in conference committee. And Representative Halverson and Representative Baker, and of course the chief author Liz Olson, were amazing. So with that, there are some other appropriations I think are very important. You do have a handout, members, on your desk with these appropriations. One that we felt that we had to compromise with the House because they had a lot of money going to tribal issues. And so the traditional healing grants from DHS was one of the governor's #1 issues that he needed to have in this bill. And so we provide $2 million per year, $4 million for the biennium for 5 years, and then, as I said, after 5 years, all these grants, all these dollars going out, get another relook. There is money going to non-narcotic pain management, just 1 year, $1,250,000. There's money to the ECHO projects from St. Gabriel's and Hennepin Health, and of course money to support the Rumler Foundation. And we put money for the results first, $300,000 per year, to make sure that we get the results back, to make sure these programs are efficient, effective, and that we are bending this curve. We supported the BCA. In the Senate bill, we had drug scientists and labs. They're really short. They needed some support in that area. And then we accepted the House BCA agents for drug enforcement. And then, of course, for the Board of Pharmacy to do administration of collection of these fees, and also for the implementation of the prescription monitoring program, which was another big win for the Senate because the House did not have the prescription monitoring program in their bill. And that is a piece that does curb and does stop the doctor shopping, which has been prevalent in this epidemic. And, of course, we then have the DHS administration fees. So with that, members, I stand for questions. I can't, like I said, can't be any more proud of this bill. I think it's a great combination of all the priorities in the state, and it is it's the right direction to go because we had to do something. We have to do something about this epidemic and this scourge. It's not getting any better. And if it's not opioids, it's heroin, it's street drugs, it's methamphetamine, it keeps going on and on. So with that, members, I stand for questions.
Discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report for House File 400. Senator Hayden.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Rosen and Senator Eaton and all that have worked on this. It has been a long time in coming to try to figure out how we can hold the drug companies accountable for what we now know was something that was placed upon many of our citizens throughout the country, and especially in this state. One of the things that I know is that this issue of opioids and drug treatment or drug addiction or substance use disorder is something that has been around for a while. We know that Senator Rosen has worked tirelessly in years past on methamphetamines, and many in this body, including myself, have worked to fund treatment organizations. One of the things that I've discussed with Senator Rosen and Eaton, and I do think that it is a good bill, and I think that the structure of the bill is fundamentally good. Though I will say that I do think that the makeup of the advisory committee has some missing components, and I'll tell you the one. In the African American community, we are twice as likely to overdose on opioids as whites. There is a sharp increase in the country of 94%. I just pulled up a Washington Post article of overdoses in the African American community, in particular due to fentanyl. And so as I looked through the bill, I saw some language at the end that said that the commissioner may take a look at appointing someone that is disproportionately affected by this in communities of color, but there is no specific notion of an African American person to be here. There are a lot of other people. Senator, I won't bother you to go through it again. Senator Rose has done such a good job in talking about who's on it, and I've had this discussion throughout this bill, and I would just have to say that as proud as I am of the work that we are getting done, I am extremely disappointed that we didn't add, and I've sent language over to not only Senator Rosen but also Senator Eaton, add a member of the African American community so that as we go through and make these decisions on who should get these resources, we make sure that the communities that are disproportionate, historically disproportionate, that are affected by this issue. I appreciate, and this is not to negate any of the great work of the people who are here and any of the folks that did get appointed to this, but what I worry about is that we may get a group that may not be cognizant and may not have the understanding or the relationships in this community to get the resources where we need it, and therefore we won't be effective in that. So I won't take a lot more of members' time. I start to ask specific questions. It is a conference report, and it is what it is. But I do think that we need to continue to really do the work that we need to do the research. There is historic trauma that has been placed upon these communities throughout the country. It was designed in order to give, and this is a fact, that these drugs went through these communities. As the jobs left, the dope came in. As the jobs left, the drugs came in, and the despair came along with it. Many of you members know, and I've told this story before, that my father runs a treatment center. He runs a treatment center. He's had it since 1976, but he got sober in 1972. And so I stand as what they call a child of an alcoholic and one that used drugs. So I'm very familiar with how this works. And because of this state and its commitment to treatment and commitment to this community, he was able to get sober. Then he was able to open up his own treatment center and help tens of thousands of lives. So I would not suggest that this group would not look to organizations like his or others to make sure that we were doing what we needed to do to curb that. But what I am saying is that if we're not intentional in this, if it just becomes kind of a footnote and commissioners' ideal, or it becomes part of a bureaucratic process, often people of color, especially African Americans, lose in that process. So I am going to vote for the bill today, but I am disappointed that we couldn't have an African American on the task force.
Further discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report? Senator Eaton.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, this has been a labor of love and a lot of work, and I thank Senator Rosen for all of her work on this and partnership, and we actually battle each other pretty well and usually come out with a better product at the end. So I think that this is a bill to be proud of. I'm really pleased that we've reached this point. I know that Senator Hayden's disappointed in that we didn't name specifically an African American on the council. We did say that the appointment should provide geographic, racial, and gender diversity and must represent a community of color that is disproportionately affected by the opioid epidemic. The only ethnic group or culture that's listed are the Ojibwe and the Dakota tribes, because they're sovereign nations. Otherwise, we got into, do we do a Latino, a Hmong? I mean, you know how many different people we have here in Minnesota. We just couldn't have a advisory council large enough to accommodate everyone. And I do recognize that the African American community has been harmed more than most by this epidemic. I will do my best to convince the commissioner to appoint a high proportion of African Americans to this council. There's no reason why any of them can't be a person of color. So, this bill came about originally with many of us who lost loved ones. My daughter died of a heroin overdose back in 2007, and Dave Baker's son passed in, I think it was 2011, and I know that the Steve Rumler Hope Network is full of parents who lost their children to this epidemic, and a lot of tears have been shed designing this bill, and a lot of hard work. And I know that there's a lot of children looking down, proud of their parents today for all the hard work they put into this. And I'm hoping that we can use this bill to prevent other parents from having to go through the trauma and the loss that we did. It's a horrible, horrific thing to go through, the worst day of my life. And I don't wish it on anybody. It's a club nobody wants to belong to. And this bill will hopefully provide prevention, education, and resources for people who absolutely need opioids but end up with the side effect of addiction. As long as people are prescribed opioids, there will be people with addiction. And so we need a way to treat them and to help them when that happens. And we protect those who are dying in hospice, whatever. There's no restrictions on their use of opioids, and we don't address chronic pain use of opioids at all in this bill. It's not addressed. And I don't recommend it, but if you're on them, I don't see any sense in taking them away, because then people go to the streets and they end up with fentanyl-laced opioids and they die. And I don't want that to happen to anybody. So I guess I just need to thank everybody who helped with this. Again, Senator Rosen and her staff, and my LA, David Gross, and members of the Steve Rumler Hope Network who've driven and come here just about every day this was on the agenda. Thank you.
Further discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report, Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also want to say thank you to Senator Rosens, Senator Eaton, and Representative Dave Baker for working on this issue. I've known Julie for 3 years, and ever since I've known her, Senator Rosen, she's been working on this issue. She tends to take on some of the bigger issues. We all have some issues that are smaller, some that are larger, but Senator Rosen always seems to take on the big issues. If it's not a methamphetamine crisis, a U.S. bank stadium, a pension bill, or an opioid bill, Julie takes this on with no fear, works hard, and gets it done. She should be proud. Senator Senjum and myself and the Capital Investment Committee toured the state of Minnesota last year, and no matter what town it was in, where we were at, the opioid crisis came up. This is something that needed to be addressed, and Senator Rosen and the rest who's worked on this bill have done a phenomenal job. It's something the entire Senate, the entire legislature should be proud of. So again, I want to say thank you and support House File 400.
Further discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report, Senator Franzen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I did not plan to speak, but I'm tangled, so 1 second. I do want to take a moment to recognize my colleague to the right, Senator Eaton. Thank you, Senator Rosen, for bringing this bill forward, but I truly want to recognize that this bill wouldn't be the bill it is without Senator Eaton. I think I met her right after her election, and I think that this issue brought her to us, and this bill wouldn't be in front of us if it wasn't for her and for what she's gone through. I know that your daughter, Ariel, is watching you from heaven and thanking you for your work. And if you shared with me some of the stories of people who come to you daily with their stories, and people don't know that you have been for them, you have been their voice. And I want to recognize you, and I want to thank you for making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. And I just want to commend you for the work that you've done every day for a very long time. And it will make a difference. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report? Senator Senjum.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. A lot of thank yous tonight, but I think appropriately so. This is an important bill. Senator Rosen and I came into this chamber in 2003 in January. There were 13 young freshman Republican senators. There's now she and I left. and I've enjoyed working with her every minute of those now 17 years. But members, I think we all know about this problem. We don't need to get into that any further. But I think members, this is a special moment, as Senator Rosen described. I think it's a special moment for all of us because we have an opportunity as members of this body and certainly representing the people of the state of Minnesota to say, yes, we're here, we're going to do something about it. And every great once in a while I look up at the scroll across our ceiling here tonight and it talks about in our day, in our generation, performing something to be worthy of being remembered. Something worthy to be remembered. And this night and this bill, I think for all of us, is something worthy to be remembered. It will live on, it will provide, it will say, at least to the people of Minnesota, no to this epidemic, no, we're going to fight back. And Senator Rosen, Senator Eaton, and all of those that were involved in this. But tonight we get the pleasure of also sharing in this victory. And I just stand here with some degree of emotion, saying thank you to all who worked on this. It's our privilege tonight, I think, to cast that green button, cast that green vote in favor of a remarkable effort and a remarkable bill. Thank you to all that worked on it. Thank you, Mr. President.
Further discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report? Senator Jensen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would also want to thank Senator Rosen and Senator Eaton for their work on this. Today, in a sense, is a destination, but I think it's important to remember that from way back when, years ago, when you started working on it, from then until now, you've already had a large impact. You've raised the level of consciousness regarding opiate prescribing in this state. You already have physician groups and hospital systems incorporating opiate prescribing strategies and policies and protocols. So already your work is providing good fruit, and going forward, it'll certainly provide more. So thank you.
Members, any further discussion on the adoption of the conference committee report? Seeing none, Senator Rosen renews her motion to adopt the conference committee report on House File 400. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails. The Secretary will give House File 400 its third reading.
House File number 400, a bill for an act relating to health, establishing the Opioid Addiction Advisory Council.
Third reading. Final comments on the bill. Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. And as I started this off tonight, I mentioned how humbled I am by this bill, humbled by the stories that we've heard, how this drug, this opiate, how drugs in general have affected families and our loved ones, and especially the children. I've been humbled by the people that we've been able to work with to craft this bill. They bring incredible strength and passion and commitment to this issue. And to stand here and have a part of this bill with so many of you in this chamber and outside these doors and craft a bill that we know is going to change the curve. It's sending a signal out there that Minnesota is going to stand up and say no more. We have a strong commitment to prescription drugs and their the way they're prescribed. We have prevention in this bill. We have a great council that's going to look at all the different treatment programs. We're trying to protect our children through the counties providing assistance, making sure that they're accountable with that money back to us. We've taken care of the issues when it comes to the Native Americans, the African Americans, anyone who has issues. I don't know what else we could have done to provide assistance and support in this bill. So for those of you who I know this is a stretch and you cannot possibly support this bill, I know you have a very good reason. I totally respect that. I completely understand. And I love you even more for standing up for what you feel is right and what you have to do. But for those of you who are taking a gamble with me and who want to send a signal to those that we're not going to allow this drug to take hold of our families and our communities and our state anymore, I'm just very humbled, and it's very moving to know that there are some people up in the chamber that I really can't mention, but I would just like to wave to them. My children are extremely important to me, and they're here to watch this bill. It's been a long time since they've been here to watch their mother work, and it means even more, more important. So I'm a little rattled, actually, to tell you the truth. So with that, members, I'm gonna end this. We have a few more things that we have to accomplish tonight, but with my deepest and most sincere thank you for your support, whichever way you can vote. Thank you.
Members, we are on final passage of the conference committee report for House File 400. Seeing no further discussion, the secretary will take the roll. All members having voted who have the desire to vote, the Secretary will close the roll. There being 60 ayes and 3 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. The Secretary will read the next message.
Mr. President, I have the honor to announce that the House has adopted the recommendation and report of the Conference Committee on Senate File Number 316 and repassed said bill in accordance with the report of the committee so adopted. Senate File Number 316 is a bill for an act relating to state government. Senate File 316 is herewith returned to the Senate. Patrick D. Murphy, Chief Clerk, House of Representatives.
There's no action required on that message. Senator, remaining under motions and resolutions, Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. I make a motion for a brief recess. Members, we have an hour and 25 minutes left. Please stay close. We'll try and give you as much notice as possible. Try and stay within 5 minutes away, and it could be any time from 5 to 10 minutes.
On the motion to recess to the call of the President, all those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. Motion prevails and the Senate is in recess.